It had already been 5 brutal years for New York's 5 families. The period was marked by public murders, humiliations, and botched coups that destabilized the entire underworld. By this point, the families were being led by Joe Bonanno, Tommy Lucchese, Carlo Gambino, Joe Profaci, and Vito Genovese. Despite being arrested on drug charges in 1958, Genovese remained one of the most feared and powerful bosses on the commission. Many believed those charges were exaggerated, almost absurd, but they were enough to put him behind bars. While serving time in Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, Vito Genovese grew increasingly paranoid. He feared that a member of his own family who was also incarcerated there and facing a long sentence, might be tempted to cooperate with the government and violate omertà, the Mafia's sacred code of silence. That man was Joseph Valachi. SELWYN explains that Joe Valachi was a low-level hood in the Genovese family who had also been arrested on a drug charge. By coincidence, or fate, he ended up in the same Atlanta prison as Genovese. At some point, Valachi either received a warning or simply sensed that he had crossed Genovese. He became convinced that his boss wanted him dead. Anthony recounts the story that Valachi believed Genovese had marked him for assassination. Genovese allegedly used a metaphor, saying that sometimes when you buy a barrel of apples, one apple is touched. It isn't completely rotten yet, but if you don't remove it, it will spoil the rest. That apple, Genovese said, had to go. Then he grabbed Valachi's hand and kissed him, a gesture Valachi immediately recognized as deeply suspicious. To him it was unmistakable, the kiss of death. Valachi became certain that he was about to be set up for murder. He believed one specific man had been assigned to kill him. While walking laps in the prison yard, 4 blocks long each time, he grew increasingly anxious. On his 3rd lap, he spotted a man he believed was his would-be assassin, Joe Beck. Beck was walking with another inmate, and Valachi immediately noticed a metal pipe. Acting on instinct and fear, Valachi grabbed the pipe and attacked Beck, striking him hard on the head. Other inmates began running toward him, and after a couple of attempts to intervene, a corrections officer finally arrived and escorted Valachi to the associate warden's office. There, an official showed Valachi a photograph and asked him who it was. When Valachi was told it was the man he had just attacked, the realization hit him instantly. He sank into his chair. He had killed the wrong person. Joe Beck had nothing to do with any hit. Valachi told the authorities to just lock him up. Anthony explains that it was a tragic case of mistaken identity. Beck had no role in any plan to kill Valachi. But committing murder in prison meant severe consequences. Facing the reality of his situation, and still fearing for his life, Valachi made a fateful decision. He approached the authorities and offered a deal. In exchange for protection and the chance to survive, he would talk. The FBI took him into custody and began interviewing him. Before long, Valachi found himself testifying before a congressional committee. A reporter announces that Joseph Valachi is appearing before Senator John McClellan's investigating subcommittee. In doing so, Valachi committed the ultimate betrayal in Mafia culture, breaking omertà. Omertà was the absolute rule of silence. No talking to law enforcement, no talking to outsiders, no revealing internal business. Everything was supposed to remain private. Another reporter notes that the convicted criminal, whose confessions to the FBI reportedly put a $100,000 bounty on his head, had shattered that code. ED explains that Valachi ripped the curtain away, exposing the inner workings of the Mafia. For more than 30 years, both law enforcement and the American public had known very little about how the Mafia actually functioned. Now, for the first time, their questions were finally being answered. Valachi was sworn in before the Senate Select Committee and asked to tell the truth. SELWYN points out that Valachi openly revealed that there were 5 Mafia families operating in New York City. He confirmed their existence, named them, and acknowledged that the Mafia, Cosa Nostra, was real. Senator McClellan asked Valachi if he was a member of such an organization. Valachi admitted that he was. When asked its name, he replied, Cosa Nostra, explaining that in English it meant our thing, or our family. McClellan pressed further, asking whether it was an organization that demanded absolute obedience and strict conformity to orders from those in power. Valachi confirmed that it was. When asked why he believed the organization should be destroyed, Valachi gave a blunt answer. First, he wanted revenge. Second, he said the Mafia had treated its soldiers terribly. As McClellan asked him directly what he got out of his life in the Mafia, Valachi replied simply, nothing but misery. And for New York's 5 families, much more misery was still to come. The renewed Senate hearings were triggered largely by the existence of Joseph Valachi himself, a 60-year-old convicted drug dealer, convicted murderer, and former Mafia member. Anthony explains that Valachi testified extensively about the Mafia, omertà, its structure, the hierarchy, and who was who. He spoke in detail about Genovese and recounted countless internal stories. Under questioning, Valachi described the organization's chain of command. At one time there had been a boss of all bosses, but that system no longer existed. Instead there was a commission, an idea put into place by Charles "Lucky" Luciano. Each family had its own boss, followed by an underboss, capo regimes, lieutenants, and soldiers. Valachi explained that his testimony created an unprecedented archive of information, facts, impressions and insider knowledge about organized crime in the United States. Alex Hortis calls Valachi's testimony a seminal moment, noting that he provided concrete evidence of what the families were, naming bars the Mafia owned and making the organization real to the public. Valachi revealed initiation rituals, membership rules and killings. He held nothing back. When asked how members identified one another, Valachi explained the coded language. If someone was introduced as a friend of ours, that meant he was a member. If introduced as merely a friend of mine, that meant he was not. That distinction was crucial. When asked what he did for the family, Valachi answered plainly, he killed for them. Hortis notes that gangsters found it utterly horrifying to see their secrets exposed on national television. Claire explains that Valachi created a path forward for future mob informants. He demonstrated that it was possible to cooperate with authorities and still survive, that there could be a life afterward. His actions opened the floodgates, giving law enforcement a powerful new tool. Insiders willing to break omertà. Joseph Valachi would die in federal custody in 1971, but his testimony lived on. For decades, law enforcement officials and journalists studied and scrutinized every word he had spoken. To the public, Valachi's betrayal of omertà offered a rare glimpse into what life inside the Mafia actually looked like. But for members of the five families, his testimony served as a chilling reminder of an existential threat hanging over their entire way of life. Omertà. For a soldier, as everyone understood, once you were in for life. There was no getting out. By 1957, the five families had been operating in New York City for nearly 30 years. 30 years of success built largely on 3 decades of relative peace. Since the murders of Joe Masuria and Sal Maranzano, there had been no major turf wars and no public bloodshed. Disputes were settled quietly in the shadows, and most members honored their oath and followed the rules. But that fragile balance was about to unravel. Frank Costello had been the boss of his family since 1937, a position that deeply frustrated his underboss, Vito Genovese. Genovese believed that seat of power rightfully belonged to him, and over time the tension between the two men began to simmer. Anthony explains that Genovese and Costello worked together and likely respected one another, but they didn't truly like each other. Sammy describes Costello as bringing a businessman's sensibility to the role. Sharp suits, polished appearance, carefully styled hair. He knew how to operate among powerful people and politicians. Genovese, on the other hand, was rougher, more impulsive, a shoot first, ask questions later kind of man. Anthony adds that Genovese tried his hand at several legitimate businesses, but unlike Costello, he failed at nearly all of them. He ran a poultry business, a liquor operation, and even a gambling boat venture. None succeeded. What Genovese did have, however, was control. He was vicious, more vicious than Costello, and that reputation earned him fear and deference. Sammy explains that when Genovese looked at Frank Costello sitting at the top, he felt cheated. In his mind, that role was his. He had been Lucky Luciano's man, the rightful heir. How dare you sit in my spot? That resentment grew into envy, possibly even hate, though it could also be seen as cold business logic. Removing Costello made sense to Genovese. One night, Frank Costello was out for dinner and coffee at Upper East Side restaurants near his home on Central Park West. When he returned home and stepped into the doorway of his apartment building, he heard a voice say, "Frank, this is for you." Costello turned his head just as a shot was fired. Instead of hitting him straight on, the bullet grazed the side of his head. The shooter fled, and Costello survived the assassination attempt. When police questioned him afterward, Costello claimed he never got a good look at the gunman. But even if he had, it wouldn't have mattered. The commission's rules still applied. Omertà. The doorman at the Majestic, however, didn't live by the same code. He had gotten a clear look at the shooter. When investigators showed him photographs, he identified Vincent Gigante. Paul W. Williams explains that Gigante was known as a protege of Genovese, bright, ambitious, and a rising star in the underworld. Rita Gigante, Vincent's daughter, recalls that someone had gone to Vito and told him to look at this kid, that he had promise. Gigante knew he had to prove himself. But according to Rita, he liked Frank Costello and he missed. She believes that, deep down, he didn't really want to carry out the hit. Anthony notes that Costello later testified he didn't get a good look at the shooter. One version of the story says that as Costello was leaving the witness box, Gigante quietly said, "Thanks, Frank." Afterward, the two men actually became friends. Costello even invited Gigante over for dinner and drinks at his apartment. The hatchet was buried. Still, the attempt on his life changed Costello's thinking. He began to believe that stepping back, retiring essentially, might be the only way to survive. Frank Costello eventually relinquished control of his family to Vito Genovese and faded into the background. He sought no revenge either in the streets or in court. He honored the code, put the family first, and kept his word. But Genovese's bold move didn't sit well with the other bosses. Albert Anastasia pressured the commission to approve a hit on Genovese, and tensions rose sharply. The city teetered on the edge of an all-out mafia war. It was Joe Bonanno, secure in his own power, who stepped in to mediate. He brokered a peace deal and stabilized the situation. In the aftermath, Bonanno declared himself capo consigliere, the chief counselor of the commission. The title was invented, but it was enough for Bonanno to believe he stood above the rules, and above the law, especially when it came to drugs. Officially, the rule was that the mafia didn't deal in narcotics. But there was another rule that mattered just as much: make as much money as possible by any means necessary. By the late 1950s, the United States had a small but growing heroin market. Heroin had been illegal since 1924, which meant there was a lucrative black market opportunity waiting to be exploited. Claire explains that Bonanno was clearly looking to expand both his power and his financial stake within the commission. The 1950s were an ideal moment. He seized the opportunity presented by the heroin trade and used the shifting power dynamics to elevate himself. Seeking to capitalize on his growing influence, Bonanno arranged a meeting in Sicily. Anna Sergi explains that the meeting was designed for Bonanno to showcase his leadership. He wanted to present himself as the spokesperson for American mafia interests. The most important boss, the man who could sway everyone else. Many American mobsters attended the meeting, which was aimed at establishing an international, intercontinental drug operation. ED explains that the central question was simple. How could they create an organization and a system capable of importing heroin from Europe into the United States? Alex still adds that the groups essentially divided up the world, reaching an agreement on how labor and responsibility would be shared between Sicilian and American organized crime. Bonanno and the bosses in Sicily came up with a plan. The Sicilians would handle bringing the heroin into the United States, and the Americans would tell them where the best markets were. This was territory the Sicilians didn't know at all, so they needed guidance. And once the system was in place, they delivered. They brought the heroin in, packaged it cheaply, $5 and $10 bags, and flooded the streets. The Americans, especially Joe Bonanno, saw it as easy money. The mafia took a commission without having to get its hands dirty. The Sicilians were satisfied because they suddenly had access to a massive new market. Claire explains that the meeting in Palermo and the relationships Bonanno built with the Sicilian mafia were crucial. Solidifying those transportation routes for heroin into the United States was what Bonanno saw as his path forward. The drug trade of the 1950s and 1960s is particularly revealing because the mafia never wanted to admit, sometimes even to themselves, how deeply involved they were. But the reality is that during the 1950s and 60s, roughly 90% of the heroin entering the United States was coming through the Italian-American mafia. Joe Bonanno and the five families' growing investment in narcotics over the following decades would become an enormous burden. Members increasingly chose profits over the risk of law enforcement. That choice ultimately ate away at the organization from the inside, while simultaneously devastating cities across the United States. ED explains that with this new flow of heroin flooding American streets, heroin use in the U.S. would rise dramatically. SELWYN calls it the most grievous sin the American mafia ever committed, the destruction of major cities. There had been no heroin in Harlem, none in the Lower East Side, none in Brooklyn. Then it arrived and it devastated inner-city communities. It's a sin, he says, that still lingers today. To the outside world, Joe Colombo appeared to be a businessman, an organizer, a public figure. But beneath the surface, he continued to run one of New York's most powerful crime families. He was bound by a strict code of secrecy, a code that, if violated, could cost him his life. As Joe Colombo's public profile grew, the other mafia bosses watched nervously. At the time, Carlo Gambino was the most experienced and respected boss in New York. Gambino and his allies in the Lucchese family had initially supported Colombo's Civil Rights League with enthusiasm. But whispers on the street suggested that opinions were changing, that all the publicity was doing more harm than good. Colombo, however, remained unfazed. By this point, Joseph Colombo had been the boss of a Mafia family for 7 years. He had risen to power at the end of the Gallo, Profaci war, a period of chaos and uncertainty. Somehow he had managed to steady the family. That may have been due to his leadership skills, or simply because the family's biggest problem, Joey Gallo, was locked up in prison. But that was about to change. Crazy Joe would soon be back on the street, and his return spelled trouble for Joe Colombo. As Colombo and members of his league prepared for their largest rally yet, the Gallo crew down on President Street had other plans. A gunshot rang out. Then screaming. Then more gunfire. Giuliano recalls hearing what sounded at first like muted firecrackers. But people don't run from fireworks. They run from gunfire. As Joseph Colombo moved through the crowd, a gunman approached him and fired 3 shots. Colombo was hit 3 times and collapsed to the ground. With Joe Colombo on life support and his chances of survival slim, word spread quickly through the underworld. Frank remembers someone coming to tell them that Joe Colombo had been shot. Almost immediately, rumors began flying. Everyone was saying it had to be a Gallo hit. Panic followed. What were they supposed to do? Who could they call? Should they arm themselves? Everything was chaos. Colombo was down. Tom frames the question everyone was asking. Was Jerome Johnson just a lone nut like Lee Harvey Oswald, or was he part of something bigger? That's how the Mafia thinks. And if there was anyone they believed capable of hiring Jerome Johnson to kill Joe Colombo, it was Crazy Joe Gallo. April 1972. Just 1 month after The Godfather premiered in theaters, and less than a year after Joe Colombo was shot in broad daylight, Joey Gallo found himself in serious trouble. He knew how the 5 families saw him. Unstable, dangerous, a liability, and likely responsible for Colombo's attempted murder. Frank explains that Joey Gallo had always been a problem within the family, and things escalated dramatically after the Colombo shooting. There was now an open contract on Joey Gallo. The Colombo family wanted revenge. Everyone knew Gallo was marked. Frank recalls being warned not to go anywhere near Little Italy, where Gallo was known to hang out. He was told to stay away from Brooklyn too. No one knew how far the violence might spread. Whether Joey Gallo was truly responsible or not didn't matter anymore. His fate was sealed. Joey Gallo knew he was in danger. Some form of revenge was coming. But outwardly he didn't seem to care. People urged him to lie low, stop walking around openly, because everyone knew there was an open hit on him. Joey's response was blunt. They didn't have the guts to do it. Bleep them, he said. They ain't got the balls to do it. And so Joey Gallo kept walking the streets of New York, a man already marked for death. At the same time, in the wake of The Godfather, Gallo became a celebrity. The movie was a massive hit, and suddenly wealthy socialites and artists in New York wanted to spend time with real gangsters, especially one as intelligent and articulate as Crazy Joe Gallo. There was a naive fascination in high society. These guys didn't seem so bad, just people operating outside the system. That fascination turned Joey Gallo into a genuine celebrity. Frank remembers Joey constantly disappearing, wandering the village, sightseeing, having coffee, talking to strangers. He'd walk up to anyone, introduce himself. Hey, how are ya? I'm Joey. He was curious, outgoing, and wanted to enjoy life. He wasn't afraid. Tom points out the fundamental problem. You can't be a media celebrity and still be in the Mafia. The bosses hated it. Was this guy going to spill secrets? Hadn't he just tried to have a boss killed? One way or another they were going to get him, and Joey Gallo likely understood that. April 7, 1972. Joey Gallo's 43rd birthday. Against the advice of his own crew, Crazy Joe decided to throw himself a party at the Copacabana. It was packed with entertainers and socialites. Gallo arrived with a group of 5. His wife Sina, his stepdaughter Lisa, his sister Carmela, his bodyguard Pete the Greek, and Pete's girlfriend Edith. The party was big, flashy, and word spread fast among the wise guys out that night. Joey Gallo was a sitting duck. He was newly married. He was celebrating with his wife and his 10-year-old daughter. Any other mobster under that kind of heat would have stayed home or left town. Not Gallo. He went straight to the Copacabana, high profile, impossible to miss. Sean explains that after seeing a show, the group went to Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy around 4:30 in the morning. Permission had to be granted. A high-ranking Colombo family official gave the green light. The gunman entered through the kitchen and opened fire. Shots rang out. Gallo tried to escape. He got up, crawled toward the door, made it out onto the street. Tom says he staggered out and collapsed dead. The call came around 7:30 in the morning. They killed Joey. Captain Robert McDermott explained that at approximately 5:30 that morning, based on the best information available at the time, an unidentified man entered through a side door, fired several shots, and then fled the scene. Joe Gallo was pronounced dead on arrival at Beekman Downtown Hospital. Witnesses later described how the gunman came in through the back door, walked up beside the table and fired 3 shots. Joe Gallo was hit twice and his bodyguard, Pete the Greek, was hit once. Frank recalls that no one truly knew what had happened until Pete the Greek was released from the hospital. Pete had been guarding Joey that night. He was shot in the backside and arrested at the scene. After being taken to the hospital, he posted bail and was called back down to President Street. When asked who shot Joey, Pete turned around and said it was Sonny Pinto. Claire explains that once the Mafia's official rules began to break down, it became easier to let everything slide. Instead of handling matters in ways that wouldn't harm the family, violence like this became routine. Killing someone in front of their wife and child became an accepted part of doing business. The continued violence of the 1970s, particularly in New York, would ultimately contribute to the collapse of the traditional Mafia families. Sean describes Joe Gallo's funeral as a powerful and emotional scene. On the steps of the church, Joey's sister screamed that New York City would run red with blood because of what had happened to her brother. Frank remembers that a massive crowd showed up. People were grieving. People were angry. Joey Gallo had been loved in the neighborhood. He was generous and people genuinely liked him. Then, on television, a host struggled to introduce his next guest, a businessman who led a colorful life and whose name had been appearing frequently in the newspapers. The host welcomed Joseph Colombo, Sr., to the stage as the audience applauded. In the spring of 1971, Joseph Colombo was the reputed boss of one of New York's 5 Mafia families. Many men had held that title before him, but on this night, Colombo did something unprecedented. He appeared as a guest on a late-night talk show. When asked how he responded to people who constantly implied he was associated with organized crime, Colombo answered that such accusations were distressing. He said it was unfair to label or stigmatize anyone through guilt by association or innuendo. A Mafia boss on late-night television made one thing clear: the 5 families had entered a new era. And this moment wasn't accidental. It was part of a carefully thought-out plan, one that Joe Colombo had set in motion years earlier. President John F. Kennedy declared that a great change was at hand, that America owed itself something better. E.D. explains that the 1960s were a deeply turbulent decade. Major social movements were reshaping the country, especially the civil rights movement, where African Americans demanded equality and full participation in American society. Women were organizing for equality. At the same time, the Vietnam War was raging, fueling protest and unrest. Sammy adds that all of this led many Americans to stop trusting the government. At the same moment, the 5 families, the core of the American Mafia, were undergoing their own transformation. By 1963, 4 of the 5 original bosses were dead. For the first time, one of New York's 5 families would be led by an American-born mafioso, Joseph Colombo. Michael Franzese explains that in the early 1960s, Joe Colombo had been part of a hit squad assigned to kill Carlo Gambino. Instead of carrying out the order, Colombo went directly to Gambino and warned him. Because of that loyalty, Colombo was rewarded with the position of boss. Franzese also clarifies that the Mafia never changed its own family names. It was the FBI that renamed the Profaci family as the Colombo family. Joseph Colombo was born and raised in South Brooklyn. In his neighborhood, the Mafia wasn't just a presence, it was life itself. His father, Anthony Colombo, was a made man in the Profaci family. When Joe was 14 years old, Anthony was found murdered in a car less than 2 miles from their home. By the time Joe Colombo reached 40, he was a made man himself and a rising star within the Profaci family. He was feared, having personally killed at least a dozen men for the family. In 1961, when the Gallo brothers kidnapped several of Profaci's men, Joe Colombo was on their list. Whether trusted or feared, Colombo was clearly the future. His close relationships with powerful figures on the commission, especially Carlo Gambino, made his rise inevitable. Chris Colombo recalls that his father looked up to Carlo Gambino like a father figure. Gambino, he says, was soft-spoken, kind, and gentlemanly with a European sense of chivalry. He was unpretentious and spoke little, but his ethics and morals were always clear. Carlo Gambino was an old-school don, a mentor, an ally, and a stabilizing influence for Joe Colombo. But unlike Gambino and the bosses before him, Joe Colombo wasn't born in Sicily. He was born in America. And that mattered. Colombo had a new idea of what it meant to be a mafia boss in New York City. Joe Colombo introduced himself publicly and insisted he should be treated like anyone else. He presented himself as a sensible gangster, a businessman. He owned a funeral parlor and a car dealership. If police showed up during a meeting, he could simply say he was showing someone a car. He was deeply business-oriented and completely innovative in how he operated. Instead of avoiding the media, he embraced it. Claire points out that despite the public image, Colombo was still running extortion rackets, and his family remained deeply involved in traditional organized crime activities. Jim Nelson explains that those activities included loan sharking, gambling, and union operations. Colombo even ran his own gambling operation personally, which was unusual for a boss. Typically those tasks were delegated. He was feared because of his history as a hitman and contract killer. He was confident, well-dressed, and boastful. Nelson adds that bosses are often made when scapegoats are needed, and that he himself became one of those scapegoats. As Colombo's power grew within the underworld, law enforcement took notice. Claire explains that the federal government's intense focus on the Italian-American mafia gave law enforcement broad authority to target Italian-American men. Even though organized crime included people of many backgrounds, there was a disproportionate focus on Italian-Americans. The Justice Department began deploying strike forces across cities to combat organized crime. Many Italian Americans protested, claiming they were being unfairly singled out and harassed, with even their families subjected to FBI scrutiny. During the 1960s, Congress expanded federal authority, allowing the Justice Department, the FBI, and other agencies to obtain court orders for electronic surveillance, authorizing wiretaps and the planting of listening devices in locations where criminal conversations were believed to be taking place. Title III of the 1968 Crime Control Act gave law enforcement broader powers to aggressively surveil New York City's mafia families, with particular focus on the Colombo family. People close to Joe Colombo, especially his underboss, Sonny Franzese, were placed under constant observation. Michael, my dad was the underboss of the Colombo family back in the 1960s. That was a very powerful position. Reporter, this man is John Sonny Franzese. Franzese, who has been arrested countless times, was described as a rising young lieutenant in the Brooklyn Mafia and one of the most dangerous mobsters in the country. Michael, my dad was extremely high profile, both in the media and in law enforcement investigations. He was arrested several times and indicted multiple times in New York State. Because of that, law enforcement was around us constantly. They had cars parked outside our house 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Reporter, these women are the wives, sisters, and friends of the Colombo and Franzese families. All of them claim the FBI is harassing their families. You must be Joe Colombo's sister. We want to get to your brother. What? Why do you want to get to my brother? Well, we're gonna put him away. Michael, I grew up hating the police, hating law enforcement, hating the government. I always felt they were harassing my dad and harassing my family. We were all in one car, 7 children. And they said, go ahead, Sonny, do something to me. Then another one pulled a gun out of his pocket and said, go ahead, because I'm dying to do it. Taking pictures. Walking into your job. Disrupting your business. Sitting in front of your house. They get me upset because they bothered my husband. They were disrespectful at wakes, at weddings. Name it, they did it. There is no such thing as the mafia. I'm supposed to be the sister of the biggest mafia in New York. I don't even know what the word means. People want to know this about Joe Colombo? No. What they want to know is, he's a gangster, he's connected to every dirty thing there is. But we, the family, know he isn't. Sean MCWNEY, you have to remember, this guy killed a lot of other mafia guys. That was his job in the Colombo family, murder for hire. He was hired by a lot of people, including the Gambinos, to do those jobs. He was a tough guy. He was a fighter. And when he saw the FBI coming at his family, he fought back. The investigative activity surrounding the Colombo family was intense. They had a very strong squad and his reaction was instinctive. Narrator, if there was one universal instinct shared by all men in the mafia, it was to protect their families at all costs, and to defend them when necessary. Joe Colombo was no different. He realized early on that the best defense was a good offense. Joe Colombo, I will say there's a conspiracy in this country against all Italian Americans. And I won't stop saying it until the father of our country treats us all like his children. Interviewer, Mr. Colombo, are you a boss of the mafia? No, I am not. Is there a mafia? No, there is not. Narrator. John Joseph Gotti Jr. was the fifth of 13 children. The grandson of Neapolitan immigrants, he found his way into crime as an adolescent on the streets of East New York. Car thefts, muggings, and street violence. He developed a temper and a taste for brutality. By his teens, he had joined a Gambino crew and found a mentor in Gambino underboss Neil Delacroce. When Carlo Gambino lay on his deathbed, he passed over Delacroce and instead named Paul Castellano as his successor. Gotti was outraged. From that moment on, a rift formed between John Gotti and Paul Castellano. A rift that only deepened as Gotti expanded his gambling and loan sharking operations, while members of his crew built a drug trafficking business. It was only a matter of time before someone made a move. John Gotti moved first. Reporter. Authorities say Gotti is being sought by the FBI for questioning in the murders of the two men who stood in his way of controlling the Gambino family. Paul Castellano, the head of the Gambino family, was killed because he was upset with Gotti and his crew's involvement in narcotics. Castellano wanted no part of drugs. Gotti did because it made him money. The killing of a mafia boss is extraordinarily disruptive to Cosa Nostra. When Gotti killed Castellano, rumors spread about who supported it and who didn't. As a result, Gotti became an outcast to many other mobsters. Law enforcement. We were concerned about Gotti, but we weren't focused on him until December 1985, when he became boss of the family. At that point he became our #1 target. The Gambino squad shifted its full attention to him. Claire. Gotti managed to evade law enforcement for several years. Part of that was his network, how well he insulated himself from specific crimes. And part of it was the perception that he was untouchable. Narrator. It had been 6 years since New York City had seen a mob killing like this. Prosecutors were forced to confront the reality that John Gotti had gotten to Paul Castellano before they could. Worse still, he had escaped with minimal hard evidence tying him to the murder. With little resistance, Gotti took control of the Gambino family. John Gotti exploded onto the American stage. Suddenly he was everywhere, front pages, tabloids, television. He was a character straight out of Central Casting. Gotti arrived at exactly the right moment in New York history. Nightlife was booming. Lavish parties, high-end clubs, celebrities everywhere. And Gotti loved the spotlight. He courted the paparazzi. He became known as the Dapper Don. Reporter. One report claimed each of Gotti's suits cost $1,000. Gotti reportedly corrected them. The suits cost $1,800. Larry. Gotti was on the front page constantly and the aura just kept growing. The Brioni suits. Andy Warhol painting his portrait. He became a star. And yet, he was a murderer. A drug dealer. All of it. People loved him anyway. There are probably still people in Howard Beach who love him to this day. He's the best man around, and I'm 45 years old. The best man for me. I've known Mr. Gotti since he was young. Always a gentleman. Whenever I see him, he has a marvelous smile. I admire the way he dresses. He's always been a respectable person in the community, and I find it very hard to believe what they're saying about him. Gotti, more than anyone else, defined the image of the mobster in the 1980s. Reporter. As the jury finally began deliberating his case, John Gotti appeared to have lost none of his sense of humor. Narrator. Gotti's contemporaries understood something he seemed to ignore. Public displays of wealth and arrogance almost always led to indictments, or violence. It was yet another violation of the Mafia's unwritten code. So while Gotti dominated headlines, members of other families watched from the shadows, resentful and wary. Among them was his former ally from the Bonanno family, underboss Joseph Messino. Anthony Messino and John Gotti lived near each other in the Howard Beach neighborhood. Heavily residential, heavily Italian-American, and located close to JFK Airport. That proximity explains some of the criminal activity that took place there. Howard Beach was home to teachers, lawyers, and families, but it was also infamous for the mob figures who lived there, including Joe Messino and John Gotti. At one time they helped each other. Gotti's people assisted Messino when they eliminated 3 captains. They helped dispose of the bodies. But despite that cooperation, it never appeared that Gotti and Messino truly liked one another. Edward. Joe Messino wanted to be the quiet Don. He didn't want anyone to know who he was. He didn't want attention or focus on him. When he became the officially recognized boss, that's exactly how he ran his family. He was the complete opposite of Gotti. Messino believed Gotti was hurting the Mafia by being too flashy. And Gotti didn't think much of Messino either. He saw him as someone under his control. Over time, the relationship became openly antagonistic. Narrator. Throughout the 1990s, with much of the commission leadership behind bars, New York's Mafia families scrambled to keep money flowing. They worked together, clawing and scratching, targeting the most profitable sectors of New York City's economy. The primary Mafia racket in New York was extortion, what insiders called the mob tax. During the 1980s and 1990s, this racket reached its peak. Organized crime had infiltrated nearly every labor-related industry, every level of the garment business. Garbage hauling alone generated an estimated $500 million in profit. New Yorkers paid roughly 35% more than fair market value just to have their trash removed. There was a 1 to 2% Mafia tax on every window installed across the city. Percentages skimmed from every single window in a city with more windows than almost anywhere in North America. Reporter: authorities allege the mob also greased the wheels at the Fulton Fish Market, controlled most of the private trash hauling industry, ran hardcore pornography operations, trafficked drugs, and infiltrated portions of the film industry. Ultimately, it was consumers who paid the price. Edward: after the Donnie Brasco infiltration became public, the Bonanno family didn't stop operating. They continued controlling labor unions, running bid-rigging schemes, and extorting businesses. But their stature within organized crime had been damaged. Because of that, they were excluded from some of the large-scale operations the other four families controlled. Locked out of the most lucrative and sophisticated rackets, they pivoted. They deepened their involvement in narcotics. They were pioneers in moving into Wall Street schemes. They adapted. They did whatever worked. The New York Post became a perfect example of a target of opportunity. Narrator: one of the Mafia's most effective schemes was the no-show job. Families would seize control of a union or legitimate business, then assign high-ranking members positions that paid well, included benefits, and required no actual work. Richard Cantarella, a captain in the Bonanno family, held one of these jobs through a union position at the New York Post, one of the city's most widely circulated tabloids. Richard Cantarella: when I got involved, I had a no-show job. Nobody was going to say anything because of who I was. I was listed as a tailman on a truck. That meant I wasn't the driver, because if you're the driver, you have to show up. As the tailman, I didn't. At the end of the week, I took care of the driver. I was getting paid and I did very well. There was always gambling going on. If someone at the Post was gambling, they had to give up a piece of the action, or we wouldn't allow it. Gambling, stealing, loan sharking. We took a percentage of everything. I always managed to stay on the books somewhere. Now I'm on Social Security. Eventually, I got involved in taking over parking lots in the marine and aviation sector. In New York City, parking is a commodity. Parking was big business. Parking lots were ideal opportunities for organized crime in the 80s and 90s, especially before electronic bookkeeping became widespread. It was mostly cash. Not all of it made it onto the books, which meant you didn't pay taxes on everything. A lot of it went straight into your pocket. It was hard to audit. No reliable way to track how many cars were coming in and how many were leaving. From nothing, I ended up with 22 locations. I had a house built. Parking was very good to me. Narrator: Richard Cantarella was earning serious money for the Bonanno family, and building a comfortable life for his immediate family on Staten Island. For his son Paul, the wealth and respect that came with the life were irresistible. Paul Cantarella: growing up, everybody knew I was Richie's son, and I was always respected. Instead of going to summer camp, I wanted to go with my father into Manhattan. I'd go with him to the parking lot and the newsstand, and then we'd make our way to Mulberry Street. It was all business. Restaurants, parking lots, big Mercedes, always dressed sharp. You saw the respect on the block. Who wouldn't want to be like that? It was the greatest thing you could see. I was so loyal to them. I looked up to them. Whatever they wanted me to do, I did. Eventually, they decided to bring me in. I got made. Me and Sal became very close. Actually, my son was probably closer to Sal Vitale than I was. He's the one who suggested I put my son's name forward. He said, "Why don't you put your son in?" The ceremony ended up taking place in my mother's basement. Joe Messino was there. Sal Vitale. Frankie. Lino. My father. And a few other guys getting made. They explained that it was a brotherhood. Then they laid out the rules. You don't lay your hands on a made guy. You don't mess with anyone's wife. That's your father now, Joe Messino. Any problems, you go to him. Joe was the real deal. You knew exactly who he was. My father always taught me, you don't ask questions. You do what he tells you. You don't do anything behind his back. And you won't have problems. People went missing, and you didn't ask why.